we think of fast food as a modern thing, a world of drive-thrus, paper bags, and glowing signs. But the need for a quick, cheap meal is not new. It is as old as cities themselves. And in the medieval period, cities were growing. They were crowded, noisy, and full of people who needed to eat. Imagine a city like London or Paris in the 1300s. The streets are narrow and muddy. Buildings are crammed together, leaning over the lanes below. Most people live in a single room. Maybe a family of 5 or 6 shares that space. There is no kitchen. There might be a small hearth for warmth, but it's not safe or practical for real cooking. Fuel like wood or charcoal was expensive. For many, it was cheaper and easier to buy a meal than to make one. This was the reality for a huge number of city dwellers. Apprentices, laborers, servants, and the poor often lived in lodgings with no cooking facilities at all. Their workday was long, from sunup to sundown. They didn't have a lunch break to go home and cook a leisurely meal. They needed something they could grab and eat quickly or take back to their workshop. The travelers were another big market. Medieval roads were full of people on the move. Merchants heading to a fair, pilgrims on their way to a shrine, soldiers marching to a distant conflict. They arrived in a town hungry and tired. They needed a place to get a hot meal without any fuss. They weren't carrying pots and pans. They relied on the town's cooks to feed them. Even people with their own homes sometimes use these services. A baker's wife might be too busy to cook a midday meal. A craftsman might not want to stop his work to tend a fire, so they would send a servant or a child out to buy something ready-made. It was a matter of convenience. The demand was huge. It was built into the very structure of the medieval city. Life was fast, work was hard, and space was tight. People needed food that was hot, ready, and affordable. They couldn't just open a pantry and make a sandwich. Their world required an entire industry of prepared food, an industry that thrived on the streets and in the small shops of every town. This wasn't a luxury, it was a necessity. Without these cooks and their stalls, a large part of the urban population would have struggled to eat a proper meal. The medieval fast food seller wasn't just a convenience, they were an essential part of the city's ecosystem. They fed the engine of the city, one meat pie at a time. The smells of roasting meat and baking bread that filled the air were not just background noise. They were the signs of a complex food economy, humming along to the rhythm of hungry workers and weary travelers. It was a system born of need, and it shaped how people ate for centuries. So where did you get this food? You couldn't just walk into a brightly lit restaurant. The medieval takeaway was a very different scene. It was a world of street stalls, cookshops, and taverns. It was loud, chaotic, and probably a little bit dirty. The most common sight was the street vendor. These were people with small stalls or carts, often set up in the busiest parts of the town. You'd find them near the market square, outside the gates of a cathedral, or on a bridge where many people passed. They had a small fire or a brazier to keep their food hot. They would shout out their wares, trying to attract customers from the passing crowds. Hot pies, hot, good pork, come and eat. The air would be thick with the smoke from their fires and the smell of whatever they were cooking. These vendors sold the simplest, most portable foods, things you could eat with your hands while walking. Meat pies were a huge favorite. Pasties, which were like folded pies, were also common. They were easy to carry, and the pastry case kept the filling warm. You could also buy roasted chestnuts, simple cakes, or wafers cooked on an iron. Then there were the cookshops. These were more permanent establishments. A cookshop was a small storefront, a dedicated business for selling cooked food. They had bigger kitchens, maybe a proper oven or a large spit for roasting. The front of the shop might be open to the street, with a counter where customers could see and buy the food. These cookshops offered a wider variety of meals. You could buy a whole roasted goose, a capon, or a joint of pork. Or you could buy just a slice. They sold thick stews called pottage, ladled out into your own bowl if you brought one. Some cookshops had a clever business model. If you were a person who had a piece of meat, maybe a chicken you raised or a rabbit you caught, but no way to cook it, you could take it to the cookshop. For a small fee, the cook would roast it for you in their big oven. This was a great service for people who had access to raw ingredients but not the means to prepare them. Taverns and alehouses were another source of ready-made food. While their main business was selling drinks like ale and wine, most also served food. It was usually simple fare meant to accompany the drinking. Things like bread, cheese, and pickled onions were standard. Some might offer a simple hot dish, like a bowl of soup or a sausage. This was the ancestor of modern pub food. You went for the drink, but you stayed for a bite to eat. These places were run by professional cooks. In many cities, cooks were organized into guilds. These guilds were like a combination of a trade union and a regulatory body. They set standards for their members, controlled who was allowed to work as a cook, and sometimes even fixed prices. Being in a guild gave a cook a certain amount of respectability. It meant they were a master of their craft. The medieval takeaway scene was a vibrant and essential part of city life. It wasn't clean or quiet. It was a bustling, competitive world of street cries, sizzling fat, and hungry customers. It was the place where the city fed itself, out in the open, for everyone to see. What exactly was on the menu? The food available was hearty, simple, and designed to be filling. It reflected the ingredients that were common and cheap, and the tastes of ordinary people. There wasn't a huge amount of variety by our standards, but there were some clear favorites that you could find in almost any town. The undisputed king of medieval fast food was the pie. Pies were the perfect portable meal. They had a thick pastry case, often called a coffin, that was not always meant to be eaten. It was more like an edible container that kept the filling hot and clean. The fillings were varied. You could get meat pies with pork, beef, or lamb. Fancier versions might have venison or rabbit. There were also bird pies filled with pigeon, chicken, or other small birds. For days when the church forbade eating meat, there were fish pies. These were filled with whatever was available from the local river or the coast, like eel, salmon, or herring. The fillings were usually heavily seasoned. Spices were a sign of quality, and they also helped to mask the flavor of meat that might not be perfectly fresh. Pepper, cloves, and nutmeg were common. Pasties were also incredibly popular. A pasty is a circle of dough filled and folded over, then baked. The classic Cornish pasty is a direct descendant. They were easy to hold and eat without a plate or fork. Fillings were similar to pies, usually chopped meat and sometimes vegetables like onions or turnips. If you wanted something more substantial, you went to a cook shop for roasted meat. The sight and smell of a whole pig turning on a spit over a fire was a powerful advertisement. You could buy a whole bird, like a goose or a duck, to take home for your family's dinner. Or, if you were alone, you could buy just a portion. The cook would slice it off for you. Pork was a very common meat. Geese were also a popular choice, especially around holidays. Soups and stews were the cheapest hot meal you could get. The basic medieval stew was called pottage. It was a thick, soupy mixture, often made with a base of oats or peas. To this, they would add whatever vegetables were in season, like cabbage, leeks, and onions. Sometimes there would be small bits of meat or bacon in it for flavor, but the cheapest pottage was often meatless. People would buy a bowl of it from a street vendor and eat it right there. It was warm, filling, and affordable for even the poorest laborers. Of course, there was always bread. Bakeries were everywhere in medieval towns. A piece of bread and a slice of cheese was a standard, simple meal for anyone in a hurry. You could buy different types of bread, from the coarse, dark rye bread of the poor to the finer, whiter wheat bread for those who could afford it. And for dessert, sweet treats were available too. Street vendors sold hot wafers, which were thin, crisp biscuits cooked between two hot iron plates. They were often flavored with honey or spices. In some places, you could buy pancakes or fritters fried in hot fat and dusted with sugar. These were simple pleasures, but for people whose daily diet was often bland, they were a welcome treat. Drinks were also sold on the street. You could buy a cup of ale from a cart. In the winter, you might find vendors selling hot, spiced wine called hippocras. It was a warming and festive drink full of cinnamon, ginger, and cloves. The menu was not fancy. It was food for fuel. It was designed to give workers the energy they needed to get through a long day. It was savory, fatty, and filling. It was the taste of the medieval street. Eating out in the medieval period was not always a safe bet. While it was convenient, it was also risky. There were serious concerns about hygiene and honesty. Customers had to be wary of what they were buying. The phrase buyer beware was a rule to live by. The biggest problem was sanitation. There was no refrigeration. Meat and other ingredients sat out in the open air, exposed to flies, dust, and the general filth of the medieval street. The water was often contaminated. Cooks didn't have a modern understanding of germs or food poisoning. Hand washing was not a priority. As a result, street food could be a dangerous gamble. A bad meat pie could leave you sick for days, or worse. This lack of hygiene led to a lot of distrust. People worried that the food they were buying was made from old or spoiled ingredients. A cook could easily disguise the taste of rotting meat with a heavy dose of spices. This was a common accusation. A pie might look and smell good, but you never knew for sure what was inside. Then there was the problem of fraud. Unscrupulous cooks were infamous for trying to pass off low-quality ingredients as something better. The most common fear was about the type of meat being used. A cook might sell a pie advertised as pork, but it could be filled with goat or old horse meat. There were dark rumors and jokes about cooks using even more forbidden meats, like dog or cat. A famous London legend told of a barber and a pie maker who worked together. The barber would murder his clients, and the pie maker would bake them into pies. While this is almost certainly just a story, it shows the deep suspicion people had about the food industry. The authorities were well aware of these problems. City governments and cooks' guilds tried to impose some order and protect the public. They created regulations to control the quality of food sold. These rules were surprisingly detailed. For example, there were laws about how long a piece of meat could be kept before it had to be thrown away. There were rules against reheating a pie from the day before and selling it as fresh. In London, cooks were forbidden from buying poultry from certain untrustworthy suppliers. In Paris, the rules stated that goose could only be sold on the day it was cooked. If a cook was caught breaking these rules, the punishments could be severe. They might have to pay a large fine. Their shoddy food might be confiscated and given to the poor or to hospitals for lepers, with the idea that their diet was already so bad it couldn't get any worse. For repeat offenders, the punishment was public humiliation. A cook caught selling rotten meat might be put in the pillory, a wooden frame in the public square. They would be locked in with the spoiled food tied around their neck so everyone could see and smell their crime. The public would mock them and throw garbage at them. It was a powerful deterrent. Despite these efforts, problems persisted. It was impossible to inspect every single pie and every pot of stew. For every cook who followed the rules, there was likely another who cut corners to make a bit more money. People knew this. They relied on their own judgment. They probably went to cooks they knew and trusted. They would look for stalls that seemed cleaner or busier than others, thinking a crowd was a sign of quality. So while medieval fast food was essential, it was a constant negotiation of trust and risk. Every meal bought on the street was a small leap of faith. You hoped for a hot, tasty dinner, but you were always aware of the possibility of getting something much worse. It was a world away from the health and safety standards we expect today. The world of medieval fast food might seem distant and strange. A world of muddy streets, smoky cookshops, and pies of questionable origin. But if you look closer, you can see it's not so different from our own. The technology has changed, but the human need that created it has not. The story of medieval fast food is really the story of how cities and people have always worked. The core reasons people bought fast food then are the same reasons people buy it now. Convenience is the biggest one. A medieval laborer with no time to cook is not so different from a modern office worker grabbing a quick lunch. A pilgrim arriving in a new town needed a ready meal, just like a tourist today looks for a restaurant near their hotel. People lived in small spaces then, and people live in small apartments now, often with tiny kitchens. The need for a meal you don't have to cook yourself is a constant of urban life. The types of food have also left their mark. The meat pie and the pasty are still popular in many parts of the world. They are direct descendants of those medieval street foods. The concept of a savory pastry you can eat with your hands is a medieval invention that has lasted for centuries. The sausage roll, the hot dog in a bun, the hamburger, they all share the same basic principle of a portable, convenient, meat-based meal. Even the problems are familiar. We still worry about the quality and hygiene of the food we buy. We read news stories about health code violations in restaurants. We wonder about the ingredients in processed foods. The medieval fear of a pie filled with cat meat might seem extreme, but it comes from the same place as modern anxiety about mystery meat or chemical additives. It's the natural suspicion that arises when you let someone else cook your food. The attempts to regulate the industry also continue. The medieval Cooks Guild setting standards is the ancestor of our modern health departments and food safety agencies. The pillory is gone, but restaurants can be fined or shut down for failing inspections. We still rely on a system of rules and oversight to make us feel safe about eating out. The street food vendor shouting about their hot pies has not disappeared. They have just evolved. Today they are the hot dog cart on a city corner, the taco truck at a festival, or the noodle stall in a bustling Asian market. The tradition of selling hot, affordable food on the street is alive and well all over the world. It serves the same purpose it did 700 years ago, feeding people on the go. So, medieval fast food was not a forgotten curiosity. It was the beginning of a long story. It shows us that our modern food culture is built on a very old foundation. The desire for a quick, hot, affordable meal is a fundamental part of living and working in a city. The medieval cook, with their open fire and simple menu, was providing a solution to a problem that has never gone away. They were pioneers in an industry that now spans the entire globe. The next time you grab a quick bite to eat, it's worth remembering that you are part of a tradition that is centuries old. The setting has changed, but the hungry customer remains the same.